Thank you very much, Andy, and it's great to get that overview of the National Parks and Wildlife Service. Now, to follow up, we're delighted to have Shirley Clerkin, who is Heritage Officer with Monaghan County Council, here with us today. And Shirley's going to tell us about her role in looking at how we're implementing and enforcing our biodiversity policies. Thank you, Shirley.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'm not as highbrow as all of the previous speakers, and I would say that with all due respect. I'm a heritage officer. I work on the ground in County Monaghan. I work for Monaghan County Council. And there's one of us, or something like me, in every local authority in the country. But there's only one of us in each local authority in the country, and I think that's important to say. We work on, we've got a very large brief. Our brief is to look at cultural, built and natural heritage all as one. So really we're looking at all of those ecosystem services and thinking about them as one together, togetherness, like folding together nature with our culture. So if we're on a bog site, for example, looking at nature, we're also thinking about what archaeology might be there and what the place names might mean. We're also looking at traditional practices at the same time. So you can see we're always trying to weave things together. But the objective is the promotion, the protection of our national heritage at the local level, working with stakeholders, working within our local authorities, and working with people on the ground. And there you can see a lovely picture of us in the sun, before lockdown, might I add, out on a bog, trying to learn best practice. So the types of things we look after there are, in that picture, we go right from the large county surveys, so doing wetland surveys, surveys of disused industrial heritage, for example, like this railway line, so we might be looking at that from the point of view of a greenway in the future. We look at the conservation of buildings and the conservation of monuments, and then also right down to the species level, maybe doing particular types of wetland surveys, for example, fen surveys, hedgerow surveys, all to feed into that baseline data so that we can improve our policy or we can see what's going on in our counties. But we exist in a global place. We exist in this VUCA, as they call it, which is what the world is now, an increasingly volatile, uncertain, increasingly complex and ambiguous world, where it's hard to get a handle on what to do, where these triple whammy, as they're called, the biodiversity crisis, the loss of species, the loss of diversity, the loss of size of our habitats, combines with climate change, and there's this negative feedback loop happening the whole time. And then, of course, we have this pollution and waste problem. And these things are expressed always very globally and nationally, but when it comes to the local level where you live, where I live, where our place, where we live in our local communities, what does that look like? And what does loss of nature look like over time? So we get used to looking at a particular type of landscape over time. We become visually used to it. We become, we don't notice the changes. There may be subtle changes. We look and we see loads of hedgerows everywhere, and we think, oh, sure, it's grand. Sure, what's the problem that the scientists are telling us? I looked out there and I saw loads of hedges in the fields. I saw lots of wetlands on my way here this morning. Sure, there's no problem. But when you get down to brass tacks, there's a huge issue with this progressive deterioration over time that you don't actually notice unless you do these periodic snapshot checks and then look back at your previous data. So I'm going to look at a few everyday habitats here, things you will have that you'll recognise in your own places. So the first one I'm going to look at are hedgerows, which are a living network in themselves, and they link together our habitats in Ireland. So if you think of your body, think of your vascular system, all your blood, your veins, your arteries, linking together your organs. Now, you can't have your organs without your blood supply, and it's the same thing for nature in Ireland. Our hedgerows perform a really important function to link nature together, to provide networks for wildlife, and to improve and protect resilience in our landscape. They are nutrient absorbers, they are important for livestock. They've just got so many amazing functions. And here are some of the hedgerow helpers. So I think when we're thinking about a crisis, which we are in, let's face it, It's easy to get despondent. I've been working in this area for, gosh, 30 years nearly, but you get despondent, and it's important to see where the helpers are. And these are some of the helpers. Here's a young man, he's a new surveyor, surveying a really lovely hedge in County Monaghan. And here are two volunteers from a local trust collecting seed from one of the only Irish native white beam trees left in County Monaghan. So look for the helpers. But are there enough helpers? And are there enough help for the helpers? These are the questions I think that we're looking at. So I'm going to show you a few maps here. So here we are. This is easy to follow, I hope. So on the left, you can see the map from the turn of the century, as in 1900s. So that's early 1900s. You can see there all of the boundaries. So in this map, you'll have townland boundaries that may have been there since the Bronze Age, in fact, as territorial boundaries. But then you have more local and more recent boundary hedges that were put in probably 150 years ago, maybe 180 years ago. And they perform an important function in Ireland because we have very little woodland cover, just due to our colonial past, and a lot of the woodland's been cut down. So we rely on these long woodlands for a lot of our bird species, our mushrooms, our fungi, our creepers, our creeping woody species. Just lots of functions. On the left-hand side there, you can see lots of hedges bounding the fields. On the right-hand side there, you can see the same area missing lots of hedges. So as well as the hedgerow extent, you're missing hedgerow width and all the functions that those hedges provide. So that's 2005 on the right. Now, here we have 2000 on the left and the most recent map on the right. So you can see again, we've lost all of those small fields running right down to that little wetland and lake there. So they've all been gone through agricultural improvement to make larger fields over time. But that's the kind of gradual loss, baseline shift that I'm talking about, that you don't even realize is kind of happening because it's happening gradually over time. So you don't notice this. So you still think, gosh, there's loads of hedges out there, there's loads of wildlife or whatever, lots of places for bats. But you can see that the loss of those hedges also has an impact on that little lake there, that little wetland, because they were buffering it from the eutrophication, from the pollution that was been put into the fields, or the slurry of the fertilizer, where maybe it's been put on at too dense a level. That's now able to flow into the wetland, which changes the species diversity of that wetland, changes the water. It actually reduces the species diversity over time. So we actually were looking at this problem in County Monaghan, and we did a survey in 2010 of our hedgerows, and we repeated it 10 years ago because, in fact, we were seeing, sorry, I've got a little timer on here to make sure I don't go over time. Okay. So we repeated it because we were getting a lot of complaints about hedges being removed, but we hadn't any EIAs coming in through the Department of Agriculture, which were looking for, saying that fields are being enlarged in size. We don't have a ranger in County Monaghan, a wildlife ranger. We haven't had one for some time. So we've got actually no resources in the county to look at hedges under the Wildlife Act. So we repeated our survey to see, was the anecdotal evidence based on any kind of real scientific truth? So you can see that in 2010, we had about 12,800 kilometres of hedges, which decreased by over 1,000 kilometres by the time we got to 2021. The hedges which were in unfavourable condition, which means they look at the width of them, the species number in them, the structure, whether they've got gappiness, whether they're allowed to grow to a certain height, were they in good condition or not? And that had declined greatly again in 2021, 88% in unfavourable condition. Species richness, which also is an indicator of our biodiversity, had declined to 23%. The type of land or fields that were beside the hedges that we looked at, in 2010, we had 28% semi-natural grassland, which is grassland which has a lot of different species in it, not just ryegrass. So a lot of flowers and knapweed, maybe thistles, different species. That had declined, it had halved by 2021 over those 10 years. And likewise, the grassland which has improved, which means it's mostly ryegrass, had gone up to 64%. So you can see these gradual changes over time, which add up to quite a lot. Likewise, we've been looking at wetlands and peatlands in County Monaghan since 2006, because in 2006, when I started working in the county, we were hearing a lot of anecdotal, again, evidence that places were being infilled. You could see diggers everywhere filling in bogs, and people really didn't give a damn about them. They were just useless places, waste ground, essentially, where you could dump your builder's rubble. So at that stage, we started looking at wetlands. And in 2006, we found that we'd lost 10% between 2000 and 2006, due mainly to the development boom at the time. But things haven't really improved since. And here's a site in Monaghan. So on the left, we've got some nice mosaic habitat, a blanket bog. On the right, I've got a colleague of mine standing on an area that's been illegally excavated, basically, for peat. And why do wetlands matter? Well, I think you've probably heard about ecosystem services and all of the great things that wetlands do for us. So again, you have to think about this holistic approach, everything working together. So important for wildlife and for ecosystem services, including flood protection, clean water, pollination services. They hold back water, particularly where there's a lot of mosses in times of extreme weather events. So these intense rainfall events that we're going to have more of in the future, wetlands can actually store that water, hold it back, and stop flooding downstream. They improve our water quality, of course, and very important for our cultural heritage as well. Lots of crannogs, lots of buried, old boats and things like that buried in the sediments of these wetlands. They're just a very important place for our heritage. But likewise, what's happening to them in County Monaghan? It's not a good story. So this is a list of 714 wetlands in County Monaghan. We've got more than one for every day of the year. I think that's something to say about Cavan. And there's just wetlands everywhere in the county. The topography lends itself to wet hollows in between our lovely drumlins. And you can see there that they've been really impacted by changes in their structure. So they've been infilled, they're being drained, they're losing their functionality, so they're losing the ecosystem services that they can deliver for wildlife, for us, for climate, for flood control. And this is happening at a local level to us. So as well as obviously these things losing their maybe carbon sequestration function, which affects the global climate, they're affecting us locally. Because if we're not protecting our wetlands, then obviously we're leaving ourselves with more eutrophied waters, more polluted waters. We're also not protecting ourselves and making our ecosystems resilient for climate change. But again, there are helpers. There are people who really want to see more conservation, more restoration of our wildlife, because slowly over the last 15 years, I notice that people are gaining an interest. They're starting to understand more. We're starting to go back to that Brehon Law understanding that we are part of nature and nature is part of us. And those old Brehon laws that imposed penalties for even just taking a bough off a tree or taking a bit of bark off a tree. So for example, an oak like this would have had a huge imposition or penalty placed on whoever had done the damage for just damaging a part of the tree, not even removing the whole tree. And in fact, I don't think there's a penalty listed for removing an oak tree because it's considered to be such a serious offence in Brehon law. They somehow understood the mycelium networks underneath these trees, how they improved soil quality, how they were important for wildlife. They had an understanding of that. So there's huge confusion now, is what I would say, from working on the ground. What and where is protected? People don't know. The laws are very confusing. The designated sites are very confusing. In Monaghan, for example, we only have 2 EU protected habitats. Everything else is proposed natural heritage areas. Everything else is not protected unless it's listed in the county development plan. Then who is responsible for ensuring which legislation is enforced? Is it us? Is it the Gardaí? Is it a ranger that we possibly don't have? Are there enough rangers? Are there enough ecologists? Who do you call when you have a problem? Who do you lift the phone to? Can they help you? Can you get the help? Do people know on the other end of the line how they can assist you and what to do? And does nature have an intrinsic right to survive? Do we as a society believe that nature has intrinsic rights to survive and to thrive? And the new Human Rights Convention that believes that we have a right to a sustainable and healthy environment, where does that lie? And what about nature places? What about all these hedgerows that are not really designated or protected? Are hedges really protected? Are they just protected for a few months every year? And what is the role of the planning system? So I work in a planning system. I know I have to finish up now. The county development plan, for example, there's not any guidelines on how you integrate biodiversity properly into your development plan. There's no real help for planners. Are there any ecologists in planning systems? No, I think there's only 1 or 2 counties have ecologists in planning systems. So then who's assessing them? How do you look at cumulative impacts? This slowly declining environment in which we're in, this slow tick, tick, tock change. I mean, it's really quite severe, and we're not noticing it. And what about nature-positive actions? Can we not incentivize those? And I just want to end on this piece. And I was listening on the way down the road this morning. They were talking about this beautiful piece of music on the Blasket Islands. It was called the Port na Pookie. And they eventually realised that the Port na Pookie had been made by the guys on the boats listening to the humpback whale. And they realised that it had come from the music of the humpback whale, right? Now, this piece of music here that I'm referring to on the screen is Mendelssohn's Hebrides Overture. Dun, 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 dun. I don't know if you know it, right? And it was written in 1828 by Mendelson because he really was overwhelmed by the beauties of the caves and the Hebrides. Now they're writing music, using that music, dropping out notes to represent the loss of biodiversity in the sea, to represent the loss of whale numbers. Now, once composers were celebrating the abundance of nature, and now we are crying for its loss. And I think that's something really to bear in mind. Thank you very much.